good afternoon, or for some of you, good morning or good evening. I'm Larry Diamond, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and chair of our project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific region. And I'd like to welcome